welcome to Revelation Made Easy-ish. This week, Ron, we're bringing the next slide. I think we have to reiterate this point. It's missed.
There you go. We've lost Revelation completely on the slide.
It'll come up if you click again. We'll get there.
Oh,
there it is. The animation's working.
Sorry.
This is kind of our points that we've tried to establish for the last few weeks, isn't on how the Old Testament comes into the Olivet prophecy.
Yeah.
And then that's the springboard to lead into Revelation. Yes. So a lot of what we've looked at previously in our first series was Old Testament prophecy, right? Yep. And kind of established how we crept into the Olivet, and we're just bringing it out into Revelation now.
Yeah, and like we tried, I guess last week we tried to endeavour to show similar structure that we saw in the seals, which I think was seen quite nicely into the trumpets and the vials, but we probably struggled a little bit with that exercise. Hopefully we'll be able to make that a little bit clearer. But the idea is that structure that's in the Old Testament that we talked about, it's the same structure that's in the Olivet prophecy.
Yep. And
it's a structure that happens over and over again in Revelation, and if you can identify that structure, then maybe you might be able to, follow through the, I suppose, the bookends of each section.
That's right. Yeah, and structure was just one of those things that we've brought out over the last few weeks. So tonight is all about time.
Yeah.
Times that we find in Revelation. So as you were saying, we're using the Olivet to springboard into Revelation. So you can go to the next one, that's fine. Here's what Jesus says. Here's sort of a key timestamp, if you want to put it that way, a key indicator of events that we can then see from Old Testaments, then into Revelation. What's this verse telling us, Ron?
I don't know. What other people think, like if you were to break that down, what's that verse?
Guinness Book of Records.
Yeah,
Guinness Book of Records.
Yeah,
what do you say that, Jackie?
It's good.
Bigger than anything else.
I love it. Yeah. Does that make sense to everybody?
The direct statement.
It is a direct statement.
It is a direct statement, and we did see that we had a wonderful parallel back into the Old Testament for this quote as well, because this was actually quoting almost verbatim Daniel 12, which
you'll come to that later.
But that's kind of cool. So big time of trouble. So
absolutely, yeah. I mean,
like nothing before or ever been.
Describes something as that. And describing where it is great.
Yeah.
And if you think of the world's history, this is kind of a scary verse, really, isn't it? Because you think about like the history of the world, this is painting something which is bigger than anything that's ever happened.
It's horrifying, isn't it? If you think of what we've experienced or even the last few generations, what's gone on, and you compare it to that, and it's like, well, it'd be worse than that if you take Jesus' word literally. Yeah. There's a few other translations that I've got there.
You want me to put this up?
I think throw those up too. They saying the same thing, but it's sort of colloquial speech in a sense. Like if you don't get that, I think that first one's NET translation, if anybody uses that. Maybe.
Contemporary English version, is it? Or the common?
The CEV, I think it's contemporary English version.
Contemporary. Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Like nothing like this will ever happen again. Now, if you sort of think, well, Jesus is God's son, he might have some inside knowledge on what's going on. Nothing like this particular event will ever happen again, or never to be equaled again. That idea. So I think Jackie's pretty spot on with that, like Guinness Book of Records comparison. There's nothing that'll ever surpass this event. I mean, we can read it, but it's often good to kind of visualize things, yeah? If you've got a soft stomach,
Turn away now.
maybe turn away. But these are actual iconic photos of war. Not that one.
That's terrible. That's awful. Oh.
I believe that was, we say Afghanistan or Sudan. That was Vietnam. She, I think, was about to be assassinated.
Cambodia, was it?
Cambodia, possibly, yeah. That is a fiance mourning her loss. And we'll say that's probably Iraq or Afghanistan again. That one, those children are fleeing from Nepal.
Yeah, that was.
And then there's one more, which is a Buddhist monk who put himself to death in protest. Those are recent, right? And they're iconic images of war, and yet you're like, well, Jesus says it works.
I don't know what it was.
So
It's a bit depressing.
very depressing, absolutely very depressing.
But it's talked about a lot.
Yeah.
So, there's the big question.
That is it.
And this is what we really want to come and look at tonight is, how long is this going to be? How long is this event? Unparalleled time of trouble, which brings us really tonight to answer the first of Andrew's questions last week about times. And so we're going to look at quite a bit about time tonight in this study. Then hopefully next week I've given some good consideration to Andrew's second question as well. So we might look at that.
It's like hanging it out there, come back next week.
Yeah, come back next week. But right, let's focus on the time.
Brilliant.
What's the time? Let's go. Right. So
I think Jesus actually answers it pretty well here. This might be cherry picked if you think it is. It's from the CEV translation again. If God didn't make that particular time shorter, nobody would be left alive, right? So there's a sense that Jesus says straight away that horrifying event, well, the time is going to be very, very short.
yeah, it's not going to be a long time.
Exactly, and God has to do such a thing, or else everybody would die.
And there, and by implication, this is an event that's going to come like real fast, but last a very short space of time, which is God's mercy. He's acting, it's going to be an act of judgment, but it's not going to last long. So, So this is where we start with one of the quotes in Revelation, which we talked about a little bit last week. But in Revelation, that it says, this is a book about things which must shortly come to pass. And by means of that, this has been, the interpretation that these events are going to be events which are going to happen very consecutive from John's time, whenever John
Soon after John spoke.
Soon after John spoke. And we won't talk about when that was, but that word, by the way, shortly there, appears twice in Revelation. It actually appears at the end of the book as well. So there are bookends in Revelation that this word is at the beginning and it's right at the end of Revelation, which is quite fascinating. The word only appears 8 times, I think, in the whole of the New Testament.
Yeah,
The whole, which would probably be the whole of the Bible, because
that's true. It's a Greek word. So
probably the whole of the Bible. So the word tachos, entakos,
not Spanish. It doesn't mean tacos.
literally means with speed, fast. Okay. And you can see that by the way it's used. So here's the first occurrence of it. And shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry day and night to him, though he be along with them? I tell you, he will avenge them speedily, quickly. So you can see the idea of a consecutive time period doesn't actually fit this verse at all.
Yep.
Acts 12 verse 7, the angel of the Lord smote Peter on the side and raised him up, says, arise quickly. That's the second occurrence. Third occurrence, make haste, Paul, and get you down quickly to Jerusalem, for they will receive a testimony. Romans 16 verse 20. So there you go, that's actually only 6 times in the whole of the Bible. The God of peace shall bruise Satan under your feet shortly, which literally is the idea of, quickly, speedily, yeah, going to happen. So linking with that thing in the Olivet prophecy, Jesus says this time of trouble, such as never was, is going to be an event which happens quickly, and it's going to happen in a very specific short space of time. And if it wasn't shortened, it's going to be catastrophic.
Yeah.
It's going to be end of life sort of stuff.
I mean, we know, say, Afghanistan war, it's gone on for 20 years. So if this horrifying thing would happen for 20 years, God has to go and make it short. Yeah.
So, who remembered the homework from last week? Oh, Andrew's got his noted.
Just checking I had the.
So, if you remember on week 1, we discussed this real connection with the Olivet prophecy and Daniel chapter 12. Yeah. So there was a real cool connection with the Olivet prophecy in Daniel chapter 12 because Matthew 24 and Daniel chapter 12, because Jesus quotes one verse that's only found in the whole of the Bible in Daniel chapter 12, and another verse which is also found in Daniel chapter 12 and in only 2 other places. That were the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, are both Jesus quotes out of Matthew 24. No one would disagree that Daniel 12 is about future events, would they? No. Is anyone going to disagree that Daniel 12 is about future events? So that immediately says there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, and consecutive to that, Michael the great prince shall stand up, and many that sleep in the dust shall awake. Some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. So Daniel chapter 12 has some pretty good connections to Matthew 24. But what we said is in Matthew, in Luke's record of the Olivet prophecy, Luke chapter 21, he does not mention the abomination of desolation, nor does he mention a time of trouble such as never was. What does Luke say instead? Jerusalem surrounded by armies. So my key question last week for homework was, where do you think Luke's drawing from? If he's not quoting Daniel chapter 12, the record in Luke is slightly different. So is there an Old Testament parallel to Luke's record of the Olivet prophecy? Did anyone find one?
What is the reference, sorry?
So just the Olivet prophecy as it's told in Luke chapter 21. So it's slightly different to Matthew, but the difference is kind of actually points you somewhere else.
Time of Hezekiah.
Oh, excellent. We've got 2. Bang, bang. We've got John Beer coming in saying Zechariah, and we've got, what's that? Saying Zechariah. So here we go. Let me just show you, this is a quick parallel between,
The prize of gift is that.
yeah, and prize. There's a quick parallel between Luke 21 and Zechariah chapter 14. Pop question, is Zechariah chapter 14 about future events? Yes. No one would disagree. Have you ever noticed these parallels? Luke chapter 21 talks about Jerusalem being compassed with armies. It says that it is going to be a desolation of the city. He says you're going to need to flee to the mountains when this happens, and there will be great distress in the land, and the people of the city will be led away captive, and then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud. Where did the Son of Man go from in a cloud, by the way? Mount of Olives. That's where Jesus was speaking. Zechariah chapter 14 starts, all nations will be gathered against Jerusalem. It says the city will be taken, desolated. Then it says they will flee to the valley of the mountains. It says the houses will be rifled and the woman ravished, great distress upon the land. Half the city will go into captivity, and then his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives. So there is a nice structure and flow between those two things. So I don't think it's the only place Jesus is like the Luke's record's referring to, but the parallels to Zechariah are quite significant when you look at Luke's gospel. The parallels to Daniel are significant when you look at Matthew's gospel. But the amazing thing when you look at Zechariah and Daniel chapter 12, they are very much talking about this future event. So these are the Old Testament talking about an event which is going to happen, the final overthrowing of Jerusalem. So now one of the other things that's in Daniel, and this is our exercise which we're going to do together for the rest of the night, is we're going to follow through this theme, through the book of Daniel and through the book of Revelation. And what we want to do is we're going to look at a series of quotes, and we're going to look at specifically what it says and find what the context is, what the connection or parallels might be. Are we talking the same subject? Are we talking the same context? What is the time period?
The time periods, yeah.
The time periods. So what's interesting, and we are going to start with this one. That went way too fast. We are looking at a time of trouble such as never was, nor ever shall be. Now, Daniel chapter 12, which we said is clearly what the Olivet prophecy is quoting when it says the abomination which maketh desolate, which is in Daniel chapter 12, and a time of trouble such as never was. Daniel chapter 12 has a date stamp. Verse 7, Daniel chapter 12. You notice that? It actually says, what does it say? Oh, by the way, I've just put in there, I like, this here's just got the king of the north scattering the people. Let's not just get confused about that. This is just because Daniel chapter 12 follows straight on from chapter 11, which is all about the king of the north coming, planting himself, planting his palaces in the land, it says. And then it says, and at that time, boom. So when you look at Daniel chapter 11, you're discussing the events of the king of the north, and you immediately flow into the next verse, which says, and at that time, Michael the great prince, who stands for the children of his people, he will stand up. So dates connecting chapter 11 and 12, this is about a king of the north, who it says in Daniel chapter 12, what does it say about our connection with?
We just say, well, in verse 7, there's a particular key fact that comes out of this verse. Like, we can't get context yet, we don't know a subject yet, but there is one thing that we know from this verse, isn't there?
That it comes from him.
Yes, yeah, that it's going to finish. And like Daniel's asking, by the way, the same question we're asking, isn't it? You see what Daniel asks in verse 6? What does Daniel ask the angel? How long, and what's going to be the end of these things? How long is this going to take? And the angel says to him, he swore by heaven and earth that it's going to be how long? A time, times, and half a time. I mean, that's
Got no idea, but it's
Oh,
a
yeah.
time now, isn't it?
but something in that, and look what it does, and see the specific words, a time, time, and half a time for the shattering of the power of the holy people to come to an end until it be finished. So to accomplish the scattering or the judgment upon the holy people, God's people, it's going to take time, times, and half time. So that's our first quote. We're going to see if we can investigate a little bit more of what that time period might be.
Yeah.
So let's go to our next one, and it's going back, Daniel chapter 7.
Just so in context, all these verses refer to the time of trouble, don't they?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
So even though we think, where are we going with these random verses, they all refer to the central theme of the time of trouble, such that never was.
Yeah. So we're going to suggest that all of these quotes we go to are interlocked.
Mhm.
You can basically completely lock hands with these quotes, and you can connect them. Well, let's see if we can. Can we connect them by subject matter, by time, by context? So Daniel chapter 7 in verse 25, it talks about the certain big mouth horn that comes out, and he speaks against the Most High, verse 25, and he's going to wear out the saints of the Most High and think to change times and seasons, and he's going to be allowed to do this. It's going to be given into his hand for time, time, and half a time. But you'll notice, context-wise, the court shall sit in judgment, his dominion will be taken away, and then verse 27, and the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven will be given to the people, the saints of the Most High, and his kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom. So you see the intimate connection between chapter 12 is how long to bring about this punishment upon the holy people, Israel, for a time, and a dividing of times. Now we've got exactly the same time period, and it's talking about a judgment upon the people of the Most High, and he's allowed to do this for exactly the same time. And when
the
it's
context, is it?
that's the context.
Yeah. So we've got a time and a context now,
We've got a time and a context.
joining these two verses together. Yep.
Would you say that? It's the same context of a scattering of the people, and it ends in the kingdoms of this world becoming the kingdoms of our Lord, which is exactly Daniel chapter 12 as well. So context, same subject, same time period, same time of trouble such as never was. Bad times for the people of the Most High
So far.
Okay.
Hang on, Jackie.
I'm struggling with how the King of the North arrived in Daniel chapter 12.
So am I, who's that?
So just at the end of chapter 11, the subject is all about the king of the south. Well, if you look at the whole of chapter 11, we probably, in fact, if you look at the header on most of your pages, you'll see it says the king of the north versus the king of the south. If you follow through chapter 11, you'll find that it's the king of the north that
He's victorious.
he's victorious against the king of the south, and then you flow into chapter 12. At that time, you get an intervention. So the king of the north versus the king of the south, big battle. big five. It's all over the land, you see. You'll see the end of verse 45. He shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. So this is a conflict between two kings who pitch in the glorious holy mountain, and at that time Michael stands up.
Okay, my next question is, that's political Israel, and the other one is spiritual Israel, isn't it?
No, is it?
Sorry?
Is it?
You're just blocking time.
At the moment, we're just blocking time frame.
Oh, sorry, I have to ask the questions along the way. Keep
Yeah.
you honest.
But well, I mean,
we don't know there's 2 verses yet. We've got 5 others to go.
but see, this is where, again, if we talk about hypothesis, direct statements, parallel passages, inference, and hypothesis, what you've just said about one being political and one being, what did you say? Political. Spiritual.
The saints is spiritual, but if it's Israel and King of the North, that's national Israel.
How do you know saints is spiritual? The saints are used of Israel many, many times. Have a look at that one. Check it out. Anyway, that's another subject. We can look at that one. But right through the Old Testament, the saints are a reference to his people in Israel. His saints just mean called out ones. He's called them out, separated to be a nation unto himself, be a holy priesthood, the saints.
Which is true, but it is also used as spiritual Israel. So we
Sometimes.
either way at one.
That's brilliant. Excellent. Love that. Either way at the moment. So we're at either way. Let's keep going.
So
Now we're going to do.
Daniel 7 is in the time period of the 4th beast.
It's at the end of whatever happens at the end of the 4th beast.
Yeah, but it's during the, well, I guess we haven't quite established that yet, but it's during the, it's during the period of the 4th beast.
But it finishes with the kingdom.
Yes.
Yes. So it determines, we have to determine, this is the other thing, we're not determining who the beast are.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is part of the time of the 4th beast.
Yes, in some form or other, yes. Yes.
There's a little more, it's a little 4th beast.
Which might
Yeah.
have some relevance.
Correct. Right. So, Revelation chapter 13 now. We're bouncing.
This is a big jump.
This is a big jump. But our idea over here is to see if we are connecting the same context and the same time period. So in Revelation chapter 13, this beast of Revelation chapter 13, by the way, incidentally, this beast, Andrew, in Revelation chapter 13, is all 4 of the beasts of Daniel chapter 7 combined in one, because you'll find this beast has all 4 features of all of the beasts. If you combine what this beast looks like in Revelation chapter 13, it's a perfect ensemble of all the beasts of Revelation chapter 7, Daniel chapter 7.
So does that mean the beasts of Daniel 7?
All come together a bit like the metals of Daniel's image.
Exactly, the image is going to
So,
be destroyed when Christ returns, so you can get connected.
Yes.
So the beasts of Daniel 7 separate kingdoms or the same?
Well, somehow, just like in Daniel chapter 2, all the kingdoms are there to be destroyed together, aren't they? Because the image is destroyed all together. And it actually says the gold, the silver, the brass is all destroyed at once. So in Daniel, in Revelation 7, this beast, of course, it says, I saw it, it was like a leopard, had feet like a bear, its mouth was like a lion, and a dragon gave it power. Those are the 4 beasts of, so Revelation 13, this beast combines all 4 beasts of Daniel chapter 7. And incidentally, if you counted the heads and horns, it's a combination of them all as well. But that's just another little sideline. So anyway, this beast, it says, blasphemes God's name and his temple, and he makes war and overcomes the saints for 42 months. and he's allowed to do that. He's given power to do this for 42 months. Now you'll notice the language is exact. Wears out the saints, blasphemes, and it's given to his hands to wear out the saints for 42 months. This beast, which combines all four beasts of Daniel chapter 7, blasphemes God, his name is temple, and makes war and overcomes the saints for 42 months. So now we're getting quite specific with the time period, aren't we? Now we're starting to say, okay, is this the same time period? Here it's called 3.5 times. Here it's called a time, and a dividing of times, or 3.5 times. But here it's said to be 42 months. How long is 42 months?
3.5 years.
3.5 years. It's interesting, isn't it? For 3.5 years is 42 months. So let's look at our next one. So it's connected by subject matter, very much so. Daniel 7 and Revelation 13 are intimately connected. It's connected by time period. Now let's look at the next one, which is really interesting. Revelation chapter 11. In Revelation chapter 11, I think this is our key quote to the whole of the book of Revelation. This is my personal view, that this is like the chiastic verse in the book of Revelation. Chiasm, whatever it is, that one, the middle one, that locks everything together. Because this chapter is a chapter which again concludes with the sounding of the seventh angel, which brings on the kingdom. It's the kingdom of God. So we know it finishes this section, but it has a very specific thing here where it says the angel was sent forward to measure out, and this is really interesting, to measure out the temple, the court, and the people, was it? It was at the sanctuary. Yeah, the worship. But not the court. Leave that out. Now, because it says it's given into what? The Gentiles to do what? Tread underfoot for 42 months. Now, where have you heard that before? Other than here, where have you heard Jerusalem trodden down of the Luke 21. Trodden down of the Gentiles? Let's have a look at it because it's not in our quote, but I think we should look at that while we're here, eh? Because I think this is so key to our Olivet prophecy. So, Luke chapter 21, verse 24, it says, they shall fall by the edge of the sword, be led away captive of all nations, and Jerusalem will be trodden underfoot of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now, isn't that exactly Revelation 11, verse 2? Isn't it got the same city, the same place, the same measurement? Isn't it the same with all of these other quotes? Okay.
I'm sitting in Bible class in the ecclesia I grew up in, and it's 1967. That's when that was, we were told.
Yeah.
Happened when Israel took Jerusalem.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was told that as well. I believe that for years, that the times of the Gentiles were fulfilled after 1967. And yet, it's really clear Jerusalem has yet to be trodden down again. And in fact, the next time it's trodden down is spoken of over and over and over again in the Old Testament. And what we're going to suggest is in the book of Revelation as well. So let's look at our next one. It's connected by subject matter and it's connected by time period. What about Revelation 11, verse 3? 2 verses on, you have these two witnesses which testify to the faithful to try to call a remnant out, to try to bring about repentance. These two witnesses are very interesting characters because they sound awfully a lot like Moses and Elijah. They do things very similar to what Moses and Elijah do. They turn water to blood. They can pray and stop the heavens from rain. which remember Elijah did for, how long did it stop raining in Elijah's day in time of persecution?
3 something years.
It's really similar, doesn't it? 3.5 years, a time of persecution, a time of trouble. These two witnesses, they go about doing their thing, but what happened to them in the end? They're murdered. What is the crime of Jerusalem every time we looked at it? When we looked at it last, what was the crime of the city that Jesus wanted to bring punishment upon? Murdered the saints and the prophets that God sent to them. Here's two witnesses coming to witness in Jerusalem, and guess what happens to them? They witnessed for 1,260 days.
Very specific, isn't it?
Yeah. How long is that?
2 months.
42 months. So they witness for the same period of this, don't they? They are together witnessing at the same period of this treading down, and at the end of it, they're murdered. Whoever these two witnesses are killed at the end of it. And consequently, very much after that, events lead to the seventh angel sounding and God's intervention, which happens in all of these other quotes as well. Right, let's look. That's connected by subject matter and by, well, it's not by time.
How is chapter 11 connected by time period to the previous, to the Revelation 13?
42 months.
22 months.
But it's not connected to a time of trouble such as never was.
Yes, this is still a,
But you're not referencing.
oh, no. This is not saying a time of trouble such as never was and all it. In fact, this phrase here, a time of trouble such as never was, is only found in 2 places.
Oh,
That-
you're right.
that
So I
Daniel
thought
12.
That's the middle thing though.
That's the middle thing. What we're looking at is connecting the time of trouble in the sense of the scattering of the holy people, the wearing out of the saints, the making war and overcoming the saints, the treading down. So the context of the time of trouble is this bad thing, which is
Right.
treading down, wearing out, judging, killing, murdering,
Okay.
mayhem. It's these things that are given power over God's people for a specific period of time. So this horn is allowed to wear out God's holy people for this period of time.
Mhm.
This
I
one
think
is
period of
allowed.
time, I was not sure why we got that in the middle. Can't necessarily, I wouldn't have thought use that, the first one, and assume that it's going to be just as bad in Revelation 11.
Well, we're suggesting that this is all the same event.
Okay. Right, got it.
So this is our connection, as we're suggesting Daniel 12, Daniel 7, Revelation 13, Revelation 11 are all actually speaking of the same event being told in different ways, focused on different parts of it.
Sure.
So our next one in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 6 is the story of this dragon which persecutes a woman who happens to look very much like Israel with the sun, moon and stars over her head, who gives birth to a man-child who's put up to heaven and rules with a rod of iron. But the dragon goes chasing after her remnant, those that keep the word of God, and she is protected from the dragon for a specific period of time. About 160 days. So, same period of time as well. So it's connected by subject matter and it's connected by time period. Finally, again, Revelation 12, verse 14, the woman, Israel's faithful remnant, is also protected from the dragon, or it says 3.5 times. So that sounds a little bit like the time, a times, and half a time, doesn't it? 3.5 times, the remnant is being protected from this persecuting power. So this persecuting power has given power over the saints, but there's a remnant that's protected from this persecuting power all the way forward. 7 time periods, all speaking of a time of trouble such as never was, all given a very specific date, time on that time of trouble.
Bring up the next 2 connections.
connected by subject matter, and connected by subject matter and time period. So you can kind of go forward or backward in that list, look carefully at the context, and as we said, what we're suggesting is that these are actually just parallel prophecies, because this is the single biggest event that's ever going to happen. There's no bigger event, and surely God would do nothing unless he reveals it first to his prophets. So, you know, as fair warning of what this is going to be like, I believe there's a lot of prophecy on this. I think there's a lot of prophecy on this very short, specific space of time, which is 3.5 years. Now, one of the things with time, and I don't mean to knock any interpretation, because I think, you know, as I said, I think there's room for the belief in a continuous historic interpretation, and I do believe there's room also for a pre-AD 70 interpretation. But I think the focus of the future interpretation, I think, is the most important one. And in talking about time periods, which Andrew talked about, one of the things I find, I suppose, disturbing in the interpretation of time periods is that, for instance, this 42 months is believed to be a period of 1,260 years, based on what they call a day for a year. The 1,260 days is also believed to be 1,260 years, based on a day for a year. The 3.5 times, which is like 3.5 years, is also believed to be 1,260 years, based on a day for a year. Now, here's my question. Where do you get any precedent for taking a time period like 3.5 years, dividing it back to days, and then re-multiplying it into years? Take 42 months, divide it back to days, then re-multiply it into years. I get the 1,260 days, a day for a year, but I just think it's gymnastics to suddenly take, why is God saying this in times, years, months, unless he's trying to actually tell you that it's a specific time period? And I think it's a bit of injustice, really, to be playing mathematical gymnastics with these time periods. If it's a day for a year, then 1,260 days equals 1,260 years. But 42 months, you can't do that. You can't divide the months back to days and then re-multiply the years. Give me one Bible verse that can prove or allow you to be able to do that sort of gymnastics and
But I
prove it.
thought of what you were saying all the time periods are the same thing.
3.5 years, but they're literal. Yes, but see, mine's
But
different.
what's the difference between that and saying, well, divide them all into
Well, because 42,
3.5 years, 1,260 days?
because 42 months equals what? How many?
3.5 years,
Yep,
1,260 days.
1,260 days equals 3.5 years. 3.5 years equals 3.5 years. So the figure is the same figure. The interpretation that says 42 months equals 1,260 years, in order to get there, you have to divide 42 months back to days, then multiply to years.
Yeah.
So that's crazy maths.
Well, because between doing that and you saying they all equal 3.5 years.
Well, no, because it's a specific time period. 42 months doesn't need interpretation. It is 3.5 years. 42 months is 3.5 years. You don't have to say, let's calculate a day for a year.
Interpreted time times the amount of time.
No, because most agree that in the Hebrew, a time was deemed to be a year.
Exactly, but
So-
you've got to go back and work, work it out.
Well, no, it's still 3.5 years. There's no interpretation needed. By the way, one of the things I'd say about the day for a year thing is it's mostly based on the story of Ezekiel lying on his side for 390 days one way and then 40 days the other, because it represented 430 years in Israel's history. Well, it would have been pretty tough for God to get Ezekiel to lie on his side for 390 years. So the day for a year had to come in because he was making a practical example of a long span of Israel's history.
Doesn't it seem to be probably also taken as the same idea?
Maybe. We looked at the 70 weeks prophecy when we did Daniel, and I think the problem with the 70 weeks prophecy is, again, it has an end date, but the continuous 70 weeks is a bit of a struggle. And as I think David said, he's heard however many Christadelphians speak on the 70 weeks prophecy, and none of them agree, because it's
Write down, but it's just a dry process in the other ones.
Well, the similar prophecy, the challenges, which I think you mentioned in there, is nailing down the start date. And one of the things which we do know about that period of history is that the exact date in the Persian period is difficult. I think even secular history is difficult to find that start date a challenge. That doesn't totally mean that that's not totally a prophecy that will have its fulfillment in time, from the time of the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and the rebuilding of the troublous times through to the coming of the Messiah. It's part of the reason why they were an expectation, people with expectation that the appearance of the Messiah at that time.
yeah, I agree. It was obviously somehow they were making that connection because they understood, right? Well, they understood by the words of the prophet that the time was right. So the continuous historic view of the 70 weeks has a lot of merit, but there's also clearly a future application of Daniel chapter 9, which comes out in that prophecy as well. So, because it does finish with
I
that.
think one of the things I think you just mentioned again, which I think is an important thing when considering the idea of the application that they did into these prophecies, is to do with the appropriateness of the symbol and figure used. So, like you gave that example, Ezekiel, where God got Ezekiel to lie inside this side for so many days and that side for so many days, and God explicitly told him, this many days because that represents this many years of Israel's history. And the reason for God doing that was because it was simply inappropriate, for, and in fact impossible for God to do an exact representation of that, because he was providing the people with a symbolic representation so that they could understand, like that he was a living parable. And so he had it at that time, it was an appropriate amount of time, but it represented a greater time. And I think that from the continuous historic perspective of these passages, that's actually an important consideration in understanding that it's appropriate to the figure being used, that's the case. So
The only thing I'd say to that, Andrew, I agree completely, with the exception of the fact that the point I make about Daniel is he was acting out a living example. So it had to be Ezekiel was a living example. So because everything he done was a living example. So he was play acting his own life into these things. So therefore, it had to be shortened because it was representing a longer day. But if God was trying to present this another way through vision or dream, not through somebody's play acting, does he need to do the day for a year? For instance, he tells Abraham in his dream, your people will go into captivity or for 430 years. And it doesn't have to say days because there's no parable. So he gives an actual year. So what I'm saying is there's a very good reason the day for a year applied to Ezekiel. I just don't know why we feel the need to apply it to visions and dreams.
Can I ask, if they're all the same time period, what's your theory, the same happening, the same thing, what's your theory about why it uses the three different ways of talking about it? Why not say one consistent measure?
I think for the exact same reason we're just saying, is that God's trying to tell us so that we don't mess it up and saying, you know, I'll give this to you in years, I'll give it to you in days, I'll give it to you in months. He'll give it to us any way that you can read time, because Jews are very good to know that there's no mistake in this time. He wants you to know whether you calculate it by months, whether you calculate it by days, or whether you calculate it by years, it's the same time period. And I think he's just, I mean, that's hypothesis, but these are all connected by subject matter and context. And I think, you know, the time periods all add up to the same time period. So
Could it be how they discussed time?
it may have something to do with, you know, months in particular had to do with their religious cycle. So the months on the lunar cycle, so it might be quite specific. For instance, the 42 months, if you look at it, has to do with the temple and the sanctuary. And that's why it's given 42 months. Whereas the 1260 days might be talking to the people, because that's different. So it's talking about judgment upon the people and the scattering of the people with the Most High. But when he talks about the temple and the sanctuary, he uses lunar cycles and months, because these are the festive times. The same he does in Daniel chapter 8 about the offerings, the morning and evening sacrifices. So there'll be 2,300 of them. So he counts by who the focus is.
Lunar here.
Lunar, because it's religious. It's the focus is on Jerusalem, the temple and the sanctuary in chapter 11. So that's why he uses the months as this time period. So again, that's a little bit of hypothesis really, but I think, you know, there's a little bit of value in that.
Is it possible for these to be multiples of this, of 3.5 times? As in, this could be representative of maybe not 6 different 3.5 year periods, but 2 or 3?
Maybe, just that the context, subject matter, when you see all of them finishing and concluding with the kingdom, which is interesting, they all, you know, like, it's really interesting, which is one of the struggles in interpreting, you know, Daniel 7, 8, or even Daniel chapter 2. The end of these events, if they're the long, continuous historic, you've got the fourth beast, which was around in Rome, and then all of a sudden you've suddenly got the glory of the kingdom, and you've got, well, there's a whole lot of stuff that's gone in between. But unless the whole thing kind of points forward to another event, another single event, which we looked at, I think, in our first or multiple applications when we looked at it. So that was just another thing to look at.
But I think also how it starts at Daniel 12, if you want to look at it that way. And that's around the time when the kingdom is established, Jesus returns, judgment, etc. So that almost sets up within that context. And then if you follow through this clock and just add the other connections, and you can almost say that Daniel 12 is also a key verse if you want to see it with this context.
Yep. And I mean, there's some really cool language in there. As I say, that I think the key to the language of chapter 11 is pretty outstanding. Jerusalem shall be trodden down to the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. That's how that chapter starts, and it finishes with the seventh angel sounding. So it's kind of got pretty good.
Verse is called Revelation 11, verse 15, and the seventh angel blew his trumpet. The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. So that's what you're saying, I think. Awesome little verse.
Yeah. So I think we'll close with a word of prayer, and then I've just got something else just for you, for the students, for those that want to run off, have coffee, and that's a bit too much for you tonight. But I thought this might be valuable because last week I don't think we did justice to the structure of the trumpets. So I'm going to throw something up. I've thrown something up on the board behind you, which shows you the structure of the trumpets through parallel passages, and see if you can follow it through. So I'm going to ask what victim. I haven't seen Josh for ages. I just stopped recording. Oh no, I'll leave it there because some people might want to leave it. Sorry.
Yeah, that's a question. Great Father in heaven, we come before you now at the end of our time together, thankful that we could explore your word and thankful that we could look at our hope of your coming kingdom. We pray that we will always be watching through your word, and that the more that we may read it, the more clear it will be to us that your Son is soon to arrive. We pray that you would help our minds to understand these things more and more, and that you would help us to be pliable in every part of our life, including in our understanding. So thank you again, Father, for each other, that we could encourage one another tonight, and thank you for this meal as well that we can enjoy afterwards, and pray that we may travel safely in these conditions home tonight. We thank you, Father, for all things through Jesus' name. Amen.
Right. So the revealing, the revelation.
You've got a captive audience.
So if you were here in our previous studies, we talked about Joel as being the mini apocalypse. There's a parallel